was a scandal that shook Great Britain and sent shockwaves through the corridors of the intelligence community in America. Harold Kim Philby, Guy Burgess, Donald McLean, John Cairncross, and Anthony Blunt would become known as the Cambridge Five. They were well-bred, highly educated members of Great Britain's ruling elite. Between 1940 and 1951, they penetrated the highest ranks of Britain's most important secret and political institutions. They played a secret game of cat and mouse as they procured the most sensitive secrets of the Crown and handed them over to Soviet agents. From this building, the KGB received crucial information from the group they called the Magnificent Five, forwarding it to the Kremlin, where Joseph Stalin received up-to-the-minute information about British and American activities on matters of critical importance. To this day, there is considerable debate about their movements, their methods, and their motivation. But there's little argument that they were the most successful spy ring in history. The five all attended Cambridge University, 60 miles outside London. It was the early 1930s, and Cambridge was synonymous with academic excellence and social ritual. The best minds from the best families walked the halls, competing for intellectual honors and learning the subtle social skills necessary to succeed in British society.
The milieu was one of privilege, fine education. They all joined various political clubs. Maclean was actually briefly a member of the Communist Party in Cambridge. You know, one of the great oversights of British counterintelligence was not to have realized this, but he convinced them that this was a youthful aberration and he changed his mind.
Donald McLean was the son of a well-respected diplomat. Kim Philby was also the son of a full-time diplomat and Arab scholar. John Cairncross came from a working-class background but distinguished himself early on as a gifted linguist with a brilliant mind. Guy Burgess was Philby's close friend. He was brilliant, excessive, and sought out for his ability to entertain with a biting wit.
Burgess was one of those English, quote, characters, unquote, of the 30s. He was gay, outrageous, loved shocking people, drunkard, but he was tolerated because he was absolutely brilliant.
For different reasons, all were considered the best that British society could produce. When the five men entered Cambridge in the early 1930s, the revolutionary ideology of communism was gaining worldwide attention. Communism promised to cure social ills that Cambridge students could witness close to home.
They'd seen the way that the Depression had devastated the British working class. They'd watched the hunger marches pass through Cambridge. They'd watched the rise of Nazi Germany. And they all came to the conclusion that A, capitalism was not going to be able to cope with the coming crisis, and that B, the democratic nations weren't being able to stand as a bulwark with the rise of fascism, and that the only possible hope against this rise of fascism was Moscow.
A young idealistic professor lectured the students on the benefits of communism. Few knew that the professor was working for the Soviets.
The man who was chiefly responsible for recruiting first Kim Philby and then the other members of the Cambridge Magnificent Five was probably the ablest controller the KGB ever had. His name was Arnold Deutsch.
Arnold Deutsch fanned the flames, but the sparks of their rebellion were lit by travel in Europe between semesters in places like Vienna, a hotbed of political intrigue and action. In Vienna, communist ideology was often fused with a philosophy of sexual independence and rebellion that appealed to the Cambridge Five.
What tends to be forgotten is that the Magnificent Five were all of them sexual rebels as well as political rebels. Two of them were gay. that's to say Burgess and Blunt, at a time when gay sex, even between consenting adults, was illegal. One of them, Donald MacLean, was bisexual. And the other two, Kim Philby and John Cairncross, were heterosexual athletes.
Cambridge was a place where important social contacts were made. These contacts would sweep the Cambridge Five into positions of influence. This social network also gave the Soviets entree to Britain's ruling class.
They all knew each other. All the KGB had to do was recruit one and then ask that one person to recommend somebody else. And of course in no time they had a whole Cambridge ring.
For many Europeans, the 1930s were a terrifying time. Dictators like Mussolini, Hitler, and Franco began tightening their stranglehold on their countries and created alliances that threatened both the Soviets and the British. The Cambridge Five believed they were recruited by the Soviets to fight fascism, not to betray the Crown.
The Soviet recruitment pitch was really quite subtle, quite shrewd. They rarely declared themselves to be Soviets. They declared themselves quite often to be working for peace. A pitch was, would you like to work for peace? Are you a committed anti-Nazi? And the answer to that was an enthusiastic yes. It was not, would you now like to work for a foreign totalitarian regime?
By 1937, each of the Cambridge Five had graduated from Cambridge University. At the time, the looming threat of war provided opportunities for them to distinguish themselves. In 1937, Kim Philby landed in Spain to work as a journalist. Francisco Franco, a nationalist general, was struggling to take power, fighting to overthrow Republican rule. Joseph Stalin didn't trust Franco and wanted him assassinated. This was to be Philby's first mission. But with tight security, how could Philby get close to Franco? As would happen so many times in the story of the Cambridge Five, luck provided a means that no amount of planning could ever have matched. While Philby was traveling close to the front, a Republican shell landed near his car, gravely wounding the other passengers. The wounded Philby became an instant hero in Spain.
Philby was decorated for gallantry, and one of those curious ironies, it was in fact General Francisco Franco who awarded Philby with his medal.
Fortunately for Philby, the capricious Stalin changed his mind about killing Franco, an act that would obviously have ended Philby's spying career. As the clarion call to arms began to sound, neither the Cambridge Five nor their Soviet handlers had any idea that the tumultuous events ahead would catapult them into positions of authority, giving them access to the most important secrets of World War II. As Philby made a name for himself overseas, the other members of the Cambridge Five were busy back in London gaining access to the corridors of power. Guy Burgess landed a job in radio where he had daily contact with powerful and influential political leaders.
He, amongst other things, worked for the BBC as a talks producer, that is, sort of documentary or interview programs. And because he was in that position, he was able to invite really quite remarkable people onto the program. And he then had an opportunity to ingratiate himself, to entertain them, and to make some pretty impressive connections.
British leaders like Winston Churchill thought Burgess epitomized the best of the young British aristocracy. By 1939, it was clear Britain was nearer to war. That year, Stalin betrayed Western leaders, entering into a pact with his enemy, Adolf Hitler. Many ardent supporters of communism then turned away from the Soviet Union, recognizing Stalin's opportunism as a sign that perhaps the Soviet Union didn't embody the utopian ideals it espoused. But the Cambridge men couldn't admit they had been wrong.
Instead of admitting they were wrong, they simply persisted. They were also intellectually arrogant to an extraordinary degree, and in the end, that was their undoing.